Welcome to this second installment of the series, Why Do We Do What We Do? An exploration of Christian worship. This is again just an overview of what we are covering in this presentation series, and I encourage you to take a look at our first slideshow in order to see this in more detail. But for now, we'll go right on to part 2, Worship by Sight. The psalmist says, "For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light." I'd like to begin by speaking about the power of sight. First of all, we are creatures that use sight so often, and so much of our information in our brains comes from sight, first and foremost. I found a statistic that says that 83% of our information at any given point is derived from sight. There's 11% from hearing and 3.5% from smell. Those are the next two senses that are important. But I think that it's important for us to remember that we are creatures that are so sight-driven. So much of our survival is dependent upon sight. And so it's important for us to remember as we start to explore worship by sight that we are creatures very much driven by sight. And here is an example again of that motor homunculus statue that we looked at in the first part, just to remind you of that connection between the brain and the body. This statue represents the way that the brain sees the body. So if there are portions of the brain that are divided into certain functions, this statue represents how big those functions are with regard to one another. So for instance, the motor skills of the hands have so much more of a place than those of the legs. But look at those bulbous eyes and how much of the brain is focused just on our eyes. And consider how small our eyes are compared to our legs in our real bodies and how large they are here. Just a reminder of the brain-body connection that is so important to our lives. But it's not just our bodies to which sight is important, but also to our religious tradition. Our spiritual ancestors didn't just have sights, but they had visions. Now, of course, there are two meanings to the word vision. There's the one just meaning a synonym for sight, just meaning what we see, our vision. But then we also have a vision as a supernatural experience, as a visionary experience, something in which people are seeing further into the mysteries of creation and God as well. There are many visions in the Christian story, going all the way back to people such as Amos and Zechariah and Jeremiah. They each say, "The Lord showed me," or "the sovereign Lord showed me." Here we see this sense of God showing his prophets things with their eyes, that they see something deeply. Even Ezekiel says, "I saw visions of God." What a profound point this is. I saw visions of God. Amazing. And the Apostle John in the book of Revelation has this phrase strewn throughout the book. Then I saw, then I saw, then I saw. Here we have this lovely idea of sight being so integral to our religious tradition. And the image at the side there is by the great British poet and visionary William Blake, and it's an image from, I believe, the book of Revelation of the 24 elders casting their crowns before the divine throne. Just one example of the deep tradition that sight has in our Christian faith. But it's more than just sight. Images become signs. What do I mean by this? Well, we can just look at something and see it as an image. But if it has a deeper meaning behind it, it becomes a sign. And we can see this in the same way we might talk about traffic signs or traffic signals. The image has not only meaning, but consequences. Now let me explain this. If we are to see this image, we know what it is. It's a stop sign, of course. And we know its meaning is stop, and there are severe consequences if we do or do not follow this stop sign. Of course, we will hit oncoming traffic if we do not stop, and if we do stop, we will probably save some lives. So again, this is a sign that has meaning and consequence. It's not just an image, but it is something deeper than that that really affects our lives. Now, if I were to show you this sign, you would probably know what it means. Maybe you even know the French for stop. And I think that most of us, if we were to encounter this sign, would naturally stop. It's not just an image, it's still a sign. It has meaning and consequence. Even if we don't understand the entire meaning of the sign, we still gather some of its meaning and recognize that it has deep consequences. Now, if you are fluent in French, I thought I'd just throw up this sign, which is Arabic. And if you were in the Middle East, I'm sure you would still stop at that intersection, whether you knew Arabic or not. We don't understand this sign completely if we're English speakers, but we do know that it has meaning and it has deep consequences if we do or do not follow it. This is the way that images become signs. They have meaning and consequence. Our first group discussion is to reflect on your experience of worship. What symbols or visual images have most struck you in worship? Our second portion of this presentation is on sites of the church. I want to begin by speaking to you about icons in the Eastern Church. Now, the word icon is from the Greek for image or portrait, and there are these wonderful images that are strewn throughout the Eastern Church and sometimes in the West. And they're frequently pictures of saints or of biblical events or things like that that have some significance for our religious tradition. But they're more than just pictures. They're seen as windows to heaven. And just like we might gaze through a window outside, we don't see outside completely perfectly. It might have a glare of some sort, or we might see our reflection a little bit in the window. But when we look outside, we can see that there's another world out there. And so the hope is that when we look at an icon, we can see heaven. We can see something greater than just the image before us. That the icon becomes a vessel of God's greater meaning for us. Now, the wonderful thing about these icons is that every line matters. Every line has meaning. Now, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in icons. I can't tell you exactly what each line means on every icon. But I just want to emphasize the fact that every line matters in an icon. And there's a deep tradition that goes back into how these icons are written and how they are painted. Just when I say written, that's a way of saying that an icon is painted. And we have before us a Serbian icon of St. John the Baptist from the 14th century. I just love how rugged he looks, and it's a wonderful depiction of John. Now, there's a famous type of icon, generally known as the Theotokos. Now, Theotokos is a term for Mary, which means the God-bearer, and it has to do with her role as bearing Christ, of course. But I want to show you three different images of Theotokos, and I'll give you an interpretation. It's just my own interpretation of them. But just to show you how different they can be, but also how similar, and that each line and color matters. So here we have an early Greek icon, pre-year 1000. This is an icon that was apparently written by St. Luke the Evangelist. I don't know how true that is, but it's certainly an old icon. And we have before us the image of Mary holding Christ, and they seem to be enshrouded in this royal golden color, this really beautiful and vibrant image. You can see Mary is even smiling just a little bit. It's a very jubilant image of the two of them. And you can see along the side there are icons in icons of these saints that are surrounding them, almost like the great cloud of witnesses we spoke about last time, gazing upon the mother and her child. Now here's another example. This is a Russian icon from the year 1380. And if we look back and forth between this icon and the last one, and we pay attention to our emotions, I'm sure we can sense a different feel to it. Mary seems to be wearing a black veil, perhaps as a sign of her mourning, which might remind us of that line from Luke about Mary's own suffering, where her own heart would be pierced as well. And in this image, we also have the infant Christ kissing Mary as well. There's a tender moment between the two here, almost a bittersweet feel to this one versus the previous one. And here's a third example of the Theotokos icon. And this one is a Greek icon, and it's modern. And we can see it has a different sense altogether than the other two. Mary has a crown above her head as a sign of being the Queen of Heaven, as she is in some traditions. We can almost see the jubilant kind of fireworks behind her. I don't know exactly what those are. They might even be angels, the cherubim or seraphim. Christ has his hand up in the form of a blessing, and he's holding an orb almost as his own kingship over the universe. And you can see the colors are far more vibrant in this one. It has a jubilant quality to it. And when we look at all three of these Theotokos icons, we can see that they each bear the same image, but in a very different way. Each line and color and gesture that is shown matters. These are more than just images, they are windows to heaven. They are the real icons of something greater. Now, why am I talking about icons? I think icons for us can be an example of the way we ought to view visual imagery in the church. When we analyze icons like this, when we recognize that every single line matters, every detail matters, we can apply this to the rest of the iconography in the church. An example, of course, is the stained glass windows that we have. This is one from my church in St. Paul's, Sydenham, and it almost invokes the same sense of those previous icons. You have Mary holding the infant Christ, and Christ's hand is raised in the form of a blessing. St. Joseph is standing behind them, holding a light, lighting their way, perhaps. And the angels are standing to the side with the crown on the one side and the cross on the other, symbolizing Christ's kingship, but also his later suffering as our king. Again, every line and detail matters and has meaning for all church symbols, and this includes even stained glass windows. I encourage you to take a look around your church if you have stained glass windows especially, but also other iconography, to sit in front of them and to assess them in the same way that we looked at the icons as well. So let's look at a particular image, a particular visual image that is so prevalent in the church, and that is the cross. The cross can mean anything from a symbol of execution to one of victory. Now, the interesting thing is that the earliest Christian symbols are actually not crosses. They are the peacock, representing immortal life, the dove, representing the Holy Spirit descending upon Christ, the palm, being the victory palm of Palm Sunday, and the fish, representing, say, the loaves and fishes or things like that. We have no cross until about the 2nd century. Christians began to adopt this as a prominent symbol. And the reason for this is, I think, pretty obvious. If you're in a world where the Romans are still crucifying people, it's pretty unsavory to have a cross at the front of your worship space. It's almost as if we had an electric chair or, say, a syringe at the front of our worship spaces being our modern methods of execution, say if Jesus had died in that way. We have before us an image that's very powerful of a hill of crosses in northern Lithuania. People throughout the decades have brought crosses to this spot, and we can see how many different kinds of crosses there are, even from the little ones at the front to the large resurrected Christ behind. It's a very, very powerful image indeed. So let's look at 4 examples of the cross, and just to do what we did with the icons and look at the meanings behind these crosses. So this first one is from Christ Church, New Haven, and it's a church that I have very much enjoyed. It's very dear to me. And this cross is located behind the pulpit and is a very simple crucifix. We can see the body of Christ very limp. He might even be depicted as dead. The INRI up top, meaning King of the Jews, and the halo around his head depicting his holiness, and perhaps a premonition of his resurrection as well. But when we see this, I think our emotions are very much triggered in a negative sense. I don't think anyone would say this is a particularly pleasant image of a human being. Now, this cross is also important because it's the one that the parish takes and places at the front of the church on Good Friday, and the people come up and kiss its feet or bow before it. as a sign of gesturing towards the crucified Christ. And it's amazing how, as this year goes on, the whole liturgical year, you look up at this cross and think about Good Friday when you see it because of that engagement with it. Now, here is another cross from the same church, and you have an image of Christ, just like the other one. But if you were to stand below this larger cross, you would look up and see that the hands of Christ are actually pulled away from the cross. It's almost like there's a premonition of victory here over death. Jesus' eyes are open, and of course he has the halo like previously. But there's certainly a different sense to this cross than the previous one. And this one is located just above where the choir would be sitting on what's called the rood screen of the church. Here is the altar cross that is behind the altar at St. Paul's up in Sydenham. And it is an empty cross. It doesn't have a body on it. Now, I don't know what those smaller little crosses that are engraved onto it mean, but I like to think of an empty cross as a sign of the resurrection. It's a sign kind of like when the people come to the tomb and they say, his body is not here, for he is risen. We can look at this cross and say, his body is not there, for he is risen. It's not so much a symbol of the crucifixion, but of one of the resurrection and of complete and utter victory over death. And here's an image. I'm not sure where it's from, but it's of a type of crucifix called Christus Rex, which means Christ the King. We have Jesus dressed as a priest with the chasuble and the stole, and dressed as a king as well, with a crown. And his hands are not stretched out so as to be nailed to the cross, almost as it's instead as if he's going to be embracing the world. And again, that INRI has a very different meaning above him as it does above that first crucifix that we saw. The first crucifix, it means King of the Jews, and obviously invokes that sense in which Pilate put it up there. But the second one has this Jesus being King of the Jews as a resurrected and victorious king, one who is our great king and great high priest. And his arms, again, are stretched out almost as if he's going to be embracing the world rather than being nailed to the cross. So we have before us these four examples of different crosses that each have different meanings and different consequences for those meanings. And just like we did with the icons, we can look at the crosses and recognize that each line, each detail matters, and we can try to tease out what those meanings might be and what those consequences might be for our own lives, whether we see Jesus as crucified or as resurrected, as executed or as victorious. Again, the cross has many meanings and it also has many consequences. Just like those stop signs that have the meaning being stop and the consequence being what might happen if you do or do not stop. We have these crosses that have various meanings behind them and many consequences for our own lives and how we view Jesus. Now, one cross is not sufficient to show everything about Jesus, and that's why we have all these different sorts of crosses, to evoke these different meanings and consequences for our own lives. And here we have this image of Jesus, I suppose, nailed to a hypercube, which is a four-dimensional cube. Leave it to Salvador Dali to do something like that. And it's a wonderful image that brings a sense of the surreal into our discussion. So here's group discussion number 2. We've seen that icons are windows to heaven. When you look through the cross like a window, what do you see on the other side? And here's the third and final portion that I'd like to engage with this presentation. From sight to insight. Now, it doesn't end with our eyes. If we were to say that things ended with our eyes, I think we would be committing a kind of idolatry. There's a lure to idolatry with these images, because if we just let the images be images or just signs in themselves, then it becomes an idol. But if we let them be windows, like those icons, windows into something deeper, then we have this sense that the images are vessels of something divine, something beautiful and deeper, and an insight into God. We can't just stay with sight, but we must move to insight. And seeing is an opportunity to reflect. I hope that when you go to your places of worship, you will not only see, but also reflect to allow that insight to rise up in you. Now, there's a certain way in which this insight happens. This is not the only way, but it's just an example. There was a man named St. Ignatius of Loyola, and he was a soldier who later founded the Jesuit order of Roman Catholics. And he was a man who, again, he was a soldier, but his leg was hit by a cannonball, and he spent his recovery by reading the lives of the saints. And so he became a mystic in a very real sense. During Mass, while witnessing the elevation of the host, Ignatius saw with interior eyes something like white rays coming from above. This is from a medieval text describing his experiences. Now, last time we spoke about this idea of the priest elevating the host as this moment of blessing. We can see in this image here where all the saints of heaven and all the people of earth and even the souls in purgatory and the angels of heaven along with God all witness to this event, that it's this wonderful moment of the communion of saints coming together in complete and utter worship. And when Ignatius saw this, I don't think we can see it as a hallucination of sorts, but more as seeing with his interior eyes, as it says. There's a type of sight that is not just with our eyes, but with our interior eyes. And we can hone this sense by using our eyes first and foremost. But just as I said, it doesn't end with our eyes. There has to be an insight that comes through our visions. There's an insight that comes through our visual experiences. And we must not let these images become idols, but we should let them be windows for our souls, windows into the divine, so that we can hone this sense of interior eyes in a similar way as St. Ignatius. And here is perhaps one of the most important points to take away from this presentation. We spoke about icons as windows to heaven. Jesus Christ himself is the greatest icon. It says in Paul's letter to the Colossians, he is the image, or in the Greek, icon, of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile himself to all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. Jesus as our icon is this idea that Jesus is the image of the Father. If those icons that we saw, whether the Theotokos or others, are windows to heaven, we can see Jesus as a window to the Father. Even as it says in the Gospel according to St. John, Philip said to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied." Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." Here we have a very real sense of Jesus being our window to the Father. If we wish to see God, we must first see Jesus. But in order to see Jesus, I believe we have to cultivate those interior eyes. It's not about seeing Jesus with our external eyes, but of cultivating that sense of seeing him from within. And I think that this is where our worship leads us in a very real sense. That when we see with our eyes and let those images speak to us through those meanings and those consequences, we can hone our interior eyes through which we can see Jesus Christ in a very real and tangible sense. And through that, we can also emulate him. We can try to reflect him in our lives as best as we can, because he is an image of the Father. This is an image called Christ Pantocrator, and it's a lovely icon because if you cover up one side of Jesus' face, if you cover up the right side, it shows a compassionate Jesus. And if you cover up the left side, it shows a more judgmental Jesus. And I love this image because we have both Jesus the judge and Jesus the great shepherd in our scriptures. It's a wonderful image altogether. So here is group discussion number 3. Reflect on your experience of worship. What experiences have you had seeing with interior eyes? And how might we be more aware of cultivating this kind of sight? I leave that with you to contemplate. So here is a recap of everything. So why do we worship with sight? Well, first of all, we recognize the power of sight. We looked at our biology and our tradition and recognized that both are bound to sight. We saw that the human body is so reliant on sight for its information, and that our religious tradition has so much sight bound to it because of the visions of the prophets of the past. And through those stop sign examples, we saw that visual signs have both meaning and consequences. It's not just about things being images, but them being signs that have these deeper repercussions. Then we saw the sights of the church. We saw the icons as windows to deeper truths, windows to heaven. And we also looked at the cross as example of visual depictions in the church. And I hope that you come away from this with a way to look at the images in the church. Not to say that when we look at something we'll understand everything about it right away, but that we can allow our hearts to engage with the image and see what we can find as that meaning and that deeper consequence for ourselves. And then finally, we move from sight to insight. We realize that the things we see have consequences for what we believe. When we look at things, it's not just looking at an image, but looking at a sign. And that cultivates our interior eyes. And with those interior eyes, we can better see Jesus Christ himself, because he is our greatest icon. He is the image of the eternal Father in heaven. So I end with that psalm again. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. We go throughout our lives taking light for granted for the most part. And when those lights shut off, then we realize that we cannot see. But if we want to speak about true light, it's only through God's light that we see light. It's only through God's divine grace and mercy that's shed abroad that we can come before him with true sight. And using our eyes in the light of this world, we can begin to cultivate those interior eyes so that we may see with the light of God himself. And our next presentation will be Worship by Sound. Thank you very much.